We are 7 months into Donald Trump's second term as US President, and it certainly cannot be accused of having been boring. On the geopolitical front, tariffs have played a big part in the Trump administration's relations with other countries around the globe. Announcements have been hard to keep track of, with near-constant changes. So, how much is bluff and bluster, and ranting posts on the Truth Social, and how much is going to translate into a long-term change in trading relationships between the US and the rest of the world? Hi, it's Marcus Hand, editor of Seatrade Maritime News here, and today I'm joined by our resident geopolitical expert, Punit Oza, the founder of Maritime NXT, who is going to try and unpick where we are at now and what the longer-term impact will be on tariff actions today. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Marcus.
I'm not sure I envy you in the task you've taken on today, but we're having lots of conversations about what is happening with Trump and tariffs, and as well, you've also written several articles for us that we've published on Seatrade Maritime News. So we thought it'd be nice to try and bring it all together for our listeners on the podcast. So to get the ball rolling, Punit, you've characterized it as the Trump tariff maze. So where are we at in that maze, and how do we get our bearings on the current situation?
As you rightly said, it's not an easy time to be teaching geopolitics or even talking geopolitics. But the more I read about it, the more I realize that there's never been an easy time to talk about geopolitics. So I guess it's always challenging from that perspective. But Trump's maze of tariffs, as I call it, is unraveling or becoming more complicated as we speak. And that's because it's a moving target. When he did the April announcement of reciprocal tariffs, it was just the most bizarre scene I've seen of a president of America taking a cardboard box and showing it to the world what the tariffs will look like for the rest of the countries. And I think it was just amazing amount of complications which ensued after that. As always, I've written an article much earlier when Trump was still about to win the elections, that Trump, the businessman, is usually kind of much more in the scene than Trump, the president. So obviously it was a ploy to try and get trade agreements, and he did mention that very clearly, that countries need to come in and start negotiating with the US. So he's had, at the moment, some deals in place. I would say he himself would agree that it's much less than what he had expected in terms of deadlines. So UK was the first one to step up, and I think they came in quite early, and they've got a 10% tariff with a few caveats in terms of automobile imports and things like that. EU got a 15% tariff. Japan got a 15% tariff. And Philippines and Indonesia got 19%, and Vietnam got 20%. So he's actually gone ahead and signed these agreements. And I would not call them free trade agreements, because they are essentially one-sided agreements which tariff the goods from those countries into America and pretty much allow tariff-free access for American goods into those countries. So I would just call them to be basically trade agreements which are favoring the America in most cases. Also, he's paused the Chinese space, where the current tariffs are 30% on Chinese goods when they come into America and 10% on American goods when they go into China. So he's kind of paused that for a while, and I think that will remain paused for a couple of reasons before I go into the other countries. I think the US-China pause is something which is quite strange for most people to understand. And the reason for that is, first of all, timing. Most of the Chinese goods that usually come into America are essentially for mass consumption, consumer goods. And the biggest consumption of consumer goods happens during holiday season. So if you were already into August, if the tariffs would have come into play now, you would have probably seen most of the goods were destined for Thanksgiving and Christmas season. And he can't afford to actually have tariffs slapped on those goods at this point of time. That's the timing is very challenging for him. So the 90-day truce is really about tiding over that particular period. And the other thing, of course, is that it's all linked to the rare earths and critical minerals, which US needs. Currently, 80% of the critical minerals and rare earths for US are sourced from China. So in that case, both these aspects, China has a big advantage in terms of negotiation. So I think that's one of the reasons why the truce has continued to be extended. While, of course, he has basically gone ahead and put tariffs, or where he's not got an agreement, he has just slapped arbitrary tariffs for various countries, with Brazil and India being the biggest losers in that way, with having 50% tariffs on goods going into US. That is obviously something which is a big challenge. The next big loser, at least in Southeast Asia and Myanmar, is Myanmar and Laos, both of them with 40% tariffs. South Africa with 30% obviously has a big impact as well, because South Africa is somebody that Trump has had a skirmish with in past. And then, of course, there are other countries in Middle East and others which also have faced something over 30%. But in general, if you look at the maze, as I call it, it's been very clear. The Europeans and some of the other allies like Japan and EU have all got around 15%, 10 to 15% tariffs, while Southeast Asia has mostly got 19 to 20%, except the Myanmar and Laos being at 40%. And then he's got singled out the BRICS nations, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, for kind of special treatment. China, as I said, is an exception. South Africa is 30%, Brazil and India at 50%, and Russia, obviously, there's nothing there in terms of tariffs clarity, but obviously the trade is limited. So you can see that the maze is now becoming clearer in terms of trying to factionalize the world with who has stored the Trump line and who hasn't. That's the way the maze has basically been drawn up by Mr. Trump and his cabinet.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice. One of the other comparisons you've made is that of an iceberg. That's something you wrote about in an article which we published in early August. And the tariff iceberg. And the fact is that there's a lot more going on than you can actually see from the surface. Now, breaking this down, what do you see as the visible impacts and consequences, and then the hidden impacts and consequences that are below the waterline?
So I think I wrote that article with a very clear intention that I wanted to highlight that what he has done deliberately is to factionalize the world, as I explained in the maze of tariffs that he has implemented. While factionalizing the world on a deliberate basis, he has also created a lot of, let's say, non-deliberate or involuntary reactions, which will have a huge impact on how the business of the trade and shipping gets impacted. As far as the visible impact of the tariffs are concerned, he still says that he is earning billions of dollars, in his words, trillions of dollars in tariffs because of what he has done. And yes, the US Treasury has come up with numbers of in excess of $150 billion coming into the coffers of the US government. But those are not coming from the people who are exporting into America. They are hardly paying tariffs. In fact, some of the recent research shows that less than 1% reduction in prices has been agreed by the Chinese companies who have been basically selling into US. And the major exports into US from China are consumer goods like computers, laptops, toys, and things like that. They haven't really reduced that much, which means that majority of these are borne by the importers in America. And they are the ones anyway that they have to deposit the tariffs into the US Treasury. And that obviously means that it's not the Chinese companies, it's not the exporting nations that are paying these tariffs. It's essentially the US consumers which will in fact pay the tariff. And that will lead to inflation. And this is where it gets really interesting, that the visible impact of this is inflation, although I would say wholesale inflation has gone up while the retail inflation is still lagging behind. It might come up in the next month or two. But what really Trump is aware of is that he believes that the Chinese goods and the goods from the other countries will continue to get imported in reasonable volumes. There might be reduction of some sort, but eventually they will continue to be imported because there's hardly any substitute available in the market at this point of time. What that does effectively is raises the prices. And because people are uncertain about the conditions and the economic conditions going forward, they will be actually conserving cash, which is already being explained and evidenced in the various statistics coming out. And eventually, if you conserve cash, you spend less, and therefore there is what is called a demand destruction. The demand destruction will eventually cause the prices to go down because people will simply not spend as much, and that will also create a recession, or at least a fear of recession. And that is when the Federal Reserve should eventually reduce the interest rates, basically tick marking one more so-called tick mark for Trump administration. So effectively, they've got lower prices because of demand destruction and people conserving cash. They've got probably a recession, which is causing the rates to come down on the interest rates. And obviously, the commodity prices are at a very low level. If you look at the way OPEC is looking to continue to keep its revenue share of the oil market, it is still increasing production as the prices are still low. And America is still pumping a lot of oil in the market. So effectively, what's happening now is that the visible impact is there's going to be a potential reducing of interest rates and a recession setting into America. That has got a profound impact in long term because America is the largest importer in the world, and that means that there will be medium to long term impacts, especially for container shipping going into America. If you add the additional layer of the USTR charges on the Chinese built vessels, Chinese operated vessels, which might come in from October, you might find that that will have an additional impact in terms of the American trade going down. So that's the visible part of it. But let me go to the iceberg hidden impacts, which I think is the more interesting part of it. The minute you have a Myanmar and a Laos at 40% tariff and a Vietnam and Indonesia at 19-20% tariff, it creates a very different playing field within the ASEAN. The same clothing, same textiles that India was exporting or Vietnam was exporting or Laos was exporting, suddenly they've got a 10, 20%, sometimes 40%, 30% gap between just because of tariffs. They've got a competitive advantage. That will create a change in trade flows. Textiles, garments, gems, jewelries, lots of the other smaller consumer goods are all shipped from Asia into US and Europe. You will see these things change around. And obviously, what will happen is there will be a need for these countries with higher tariffs being imposed on them to find alternate markets. Some of them they will find in Asia itself, some of them domestic markets, and some of them will be completely new markets. Therefore, new trade routes will come up because of that. So this competitive advantage because of tariffs is a completely new dynamic in the trade scene. Also, on top of that, you actually find that there's a lot of bargaining going on. In fact, Trump has been very clear that we do not want to keep these tariffs. Scott Bessent has actually given an interview to Nikkei Asia the other day where he says that tariffs are like melting honeypot. Eventually, as the trade balance equates or balances itself, the tariff should melt away. And I think if that happens, then obviously this is a moving target all the time. And as India has seen, the 25% extra tariffs on top of the 25% are purely because Trump feels that Russia is being funded by the Indian purchases, while other countries that are purchasing Russian oil are not having the same treatment. So it's very much a bargaining position now. It's a negotiating tool rather than actual economic weapon, as they call it. Another thing that's happening is that, as I said, most of these agreements that have been agreed by Trump with these countries so far have allowed tariff-free access for American goods into these countries. Countries like Japan, which have had got a closed market for importing rice for many, many, many years because they were protecting the rice industry locally, are now going to have to open up to US rice. The EU, which have been protecting the French farmers for a long time, will have to open up to US grains. And therefore, these grain trade flows will actually suddenly redefine the way things happen. Who will lose out eventually? The EU will lose out. Even you will have Brazil, Argentina, even Russia for that matter, because Russia is still actually supplying grain to some of these Asian countries. And there will be a kind of an impact which America will capitalize on. So that trade will be something to watch out for sure. The other hidden impact is the alliances. The alliances which were kind of not having any real flags to wave in a big way like the BRICS, have actually now got a common cause to unite and talk to each other. Even unlikely allies are eventually talking to each other, which is creating possible to trade opportunities. The Canadian foreign minister had never really approached the European Union for many, many years. They didn't need to. They had America right at their neighborhood, and they had enough within the USMCA to actually manage their space. But now they don't see that happening with 35% tariffs, and they obviously want to look at new avenues. That will open up trade as well. And then eventually, this is also creating a huge room for China to basically further its ambitions through the Belt and Road Initiative. The influence of China across the Belt and Road Initiative is actually now becoming a clear, let's say, a poster child for free trade and trade corridors, something that China says is against or goes right against what Trump's model looks like at the moment. The last part, which is the hidden part, is this concept of offshoring, nearshoring, and onshoring. So let me just make this clear. Currently, the world has been working quite clearly on a globalization model, which is an offshoring model. What does that mean? That means you're producing at the cheapest location, which was China in most cases, and therefore you had great trade for raw materials to go into China, iron ore, coal, and a whole bunch of other raw materials. China produced those goods, and finished goods moved from China to the markets where they were consumed, US, Europe, Asia, etc. That's offshoring. If it's nearshoring, obviously you come to something like Mexico in order to supply to US. In that case, the raw materials still will be imported into Mexico because it may not be self-sufficient in all the cases, but the flow of finished goods don't travel that long a distance. They travel much shorter distances. And that is basically not great for container shipping or for finished goods trade. If it's onshoring or shoring or producing stuff within US, then obviously there is no shipments involved at all for finished goods. But US still needs raw materials. US still needs to import raw materials. And that is actually something which will fundamentally change trade patterns. And if you add the additional mix of the USTR regulations on Chinese vessels, that will complicate things even more. Just as a side note, Trump also issued an executive order asking for USTR to levy additional tariffs and charges on shore cranes at all ports which are built by China. 80% of the shore cranes in America are built by Shanghai company, ZMCP or ZCMP, I think. Eventually, that is going to create huge amount of disruption as well. So as you can see, the hidden consequences are far more severe and challenging for the industry to look at rather than what's actually on the surface.
Yeah, so that's kind of those hidden consequences. Now, that's very much given a macro picture of what's going on. You did touch a little bit on some of the individual agreements, but I think it's fair to say that when you come to these bilateral agreements, the devil is actually in the details and what exactly each one involves. So how about we kind of take a look at a particular agreement, for example, the US and Indonesia, or you can choose something else if you like.
Sure. I think the Indonesia one is quite interesting. It's not even a month old, signed and agreed end of July. And it actually is, as you rightly said, the devil is in the details. If I look at the key terms of the agreements, before I even go there, I just wanted to re-emphasize that Trump is basically putting these tariffs or even getting some of these other measures in place and putting executive orders under something called International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA. And this IEEPA is something which has already been used before Trump started using it extensively 80 times by previous US presidents. So it's not something which he has actually invented or he's misusing or trying to do it for the first time. Other presidents have used it in different ways already. So it's a known space as well. And that's why I believe that the idea of challenging it in courts is going to be quite complicated, although he has actually faced defeat at the first level of the courts, which is in appeal right now. So I just wanted to emphasize that. He's gone ahead and signed that agreement with Indonesia. I just wanted to read out some of the things which are actually there. So he's basically said that Indonesia will eliminate approximately 99% of tariff barriers for a full range of US industrial and food and agriculture products exported to Indonesia. So he's actually completely opened up that idea that more or less every single American product will not face any tariffs. Second thing he has actually said is that the US and Indonesia will negotiate facilitative rules of origin so that the benefits of the agreement accrue primarily to the US and Indonesia. Automatically, transshipment is covered in that, and that means the devil is in the details. And then, if you remember, Indonesia had banned iPhones very recently. And now he has got a very clear exemption there saying that one of the things will be to exempt US companies and originating goods from local content requirements. Something which Apple could have actually literally written in as such. And that will obviously have an impact in terms of what that trade would have meant as well. Additional things like FDA requirements, FDA certifications being valid in Indonesia, labeling requirements going out of the window. Very interesting stuff, which all basically is saying that the American companies will, whatever they do in America, they will not need to follow local Indonesian regulations. That is going to create a trade which otherwise would have been hindered by some kind of stop pages or some kind of barriers. He's removed that a lot. So you can see that actually is going to change quite a few things. Also, interestingly, he has very clearly stated in that agreement saying Indonesia will provide certainty regarding the ability to transfer personal data out of its territory to United States. This was a big problem in most countries now, that countries believe that the data that is generated in that country should not leave that country in the data form. It can leave in kind of an analytical form, but it has to be basically centered or used by companies in Indonesia. He's changing that as well. And interestingly, I Googled this a little bit. You can also do that. It says Indonesia commits to join the Global Forum on Steel Excess Capacity and take effective actions to address global excess capacity in steel sector and its impact. There is actually a body like this based in Berlin called Global Forum for Steel Excess Capacity. China is not a member of it. India is not a member of it. There are lots of other countries who are members of it, and they believe that there should be tough action, including tariffs and other things, to really reduce excess steel capacity in the world, to bring balance, as they call it. Indonesia did not want to join it, but now it may be forced to join it. And more interestingly, it says Indonesia will remove restrictions on exports to United States of industrial commodities, including critical minerals. Also in critical minerals, according to me, is included nickel ore. They have banned nickel ore in past, except for certain conditions. It might well happen that US might eventually see nickel ore also move out from Indonesia based on these kind of aspects. In general, what it does is it puts a lot more burden on the Indonesian domestic sector to kind of be ready for some major competition from US. And this is not just America. Just Indonesia. Every single agreement has got tremendous amount of openings for US companies, which means that the trade from US to these countries might actually come up. He talks about buying 4.5 billion worth of soybeans and soybean meal, wheat and cotton. And that's just one part of it. There's also other things like LPG for $15 billion. All these things will have to be shipped out if they actually do come up to fruition. So in general, I believe that, when he looks at this stuff, he's actually pressurizing the government to open up the market, make it more difficult for the domestic industry, and more importantly, open up trades which previously did not exist. I think all the agreements that he has done so far have actually got potential of new trades, but most of them are outbound trades from US into these countries. So watch out for these long haul trades, which can be good for shipping, but very challenging for the country that's importing the stuff.
I think it's very interesting to take an individual kind of look at a trade relationship there. Obviously, if we were to sit here and go through all the different countries, we'd be here for about 5 hours or something. So we won't do that. But it's kind of really good to get up to date with where we are. And I guess the question is then, what happens as we move forward from here? Now, Punit, I believe you've actually developed 3 scenarios for this. Firstly, could you just briefly tell us what those scenarios are, and then we'll delve into each one in more detail.
Yeah, so I think it's very simple. If you see the discussions that Trump has had and what he has been talking about, especially in terms of the reasons to impose these tariffs, he wants to balance the books. Scott Bessent has said that. Donald Trump has said that. His other ministers have said that. They believe that the reason they actually imposed tariff in the first place is because that country has a huge trade surplus with America, and America has a massive trade deficit with that country. So how do you get rid of the deficit as such. You either import less from that country, or you export more to that country, or you do both of them simultaneously. These are the only scenarios possible at the end of the day which can basically achieve the goals that they have set themselves out to be. So the best case scenario is both of these happens. You import less, you export more. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is it goes the other way around. You import more than what you are currently importing, and you export less than what you're currently exporting. That's the worst case scenario. And the base case scenario, or a very average scenario, is that there's no change. You still continue to import the same amount of quantity, or more or less the same one, and you really export around the same quantity, which is also more or less the same one. Now, that are the three scenarios. It's not very complicated because he has to achieve these goals. The best goal, as I said, the best chance for him, or the best scenario for him, is exports increase, imports decrease, trade balance comes out to neutrality as quickly as possible. Worst case scenario, the trade balance goes out of sync completely. The average scenario, no change in trade balance as it is. That's the scenarios.
So that's actually pretty straightforward then. There's nothing particularly rocket science or clever about this.
Not at all. And he's been very clear. I mean, that's one of the things. He's a businessman at the end of the day. So he's talking from a business perspective. So now let me try and give you some perspectives as to why and how these scenarios will work out. So the best case scenario, in order to import less, the dependence of American consumers have to reduce from these commodities or products that are being imported, right? So if you look at the kind of stuff that America is importing, most of the stuff is consumer goods and high value commodities. Now, obviously, if there are alternatives available, that's fine. But most of the time, as it was shown in Trump 1.0 term as well, even if you import less of these commodities, because of the tariffs, the import value has gone up. Because earlier you were importing them at $100. Now we got a $20 tariff on top of that, which means you're importing the same good, but at $120. Even if the quantity goes down a little bit, but there's a 20% increase in the cost of import, which means that the deficit going down because of importing less is very unlikely unless people are genuinely unwilling to sell to America at all. At this point of time, America being the largest importer in the world, I seriously don't think in short term that can happen. In medium term, you might see some changes. Second thing is you export more. So the best case scenario, as I said, import less sounds a bit difficult, at least in terms of value. The import less may not happen that quickly. What about export more? Yes, it can happen more. He wants to dig baby dig and drill baby drill and all these things he wants to try and do. The thing is this, it all is market dependent. And also the ability to start manufacturing and put up jobs here depends on two things. Number one, people willing to invest in a stable set of tariffs which are in place and remain in place for a long time. If they believe the tariffs will change in 6 months' time, 1 year, when Trump signs a new deal with somebody, how can they put up millions of dollars to set up a manufacturing plant when the whole rationale or economic rationale behind the plant can collapse if the tariff change? So that's the first thing why uncertainty will become an issue. Secondly, even if you set up a plant or you buy a plant and revamp it like what General Motors is doing with its own plant in Kentucky, it will take time to revamp it. So I believe in short term to get to this best case scenario is very difficult because there is no additional cargo to export at this point of time that America can come up with immediately. So I think that best case scenario is not happening in short term and might actually be by the time the midterm elections come, you might see a little bit of a glimmer of change happening. But even then it's very difficult because it's usually a 18 month to a 24-month process before things kind of start moving. It's not going to be an instant part. Which means we bring it to the base case scenario that you currently import the same amount and export the same amount. I think the export the same amount will probably continue because that may well be the scenario where American goods are still being bought, and it might be a little bit more if he can get tariff-free access to some of the markets like Indonesia, EU and others. But importing the same amount, I think is quite logical, because you will suddenly see the same amount of goods coming in. There have been a drop in volume, but I remember, as you say, the tariffs have made it more expensive. So the actual average volume value of the goods might still remain the same. But what I believe is that if at all something goes seriously wrong, the worst case scenario comes up, that's going to be a real issue. And I'll tell you why the worst case scenario can even come up at a later stage. First of all, you start importing more. And the reason why you import more is because once the adjustment of the trade has happened in the exporting countries, people have negotiated the tariffs, who will pay for what, the bargaining is over, who is in a better position. They've all managed to create a water level for the trade. Trade can restart very quickly. Somebody takes a hit temporarily or for a short time, reduces his labor cost and tries to continue to export. That means your imports are going to get more in terms of cost of imports. That is the worst case scenario. More importantly, I also believe that America is facing a lot of backlash, public criticism from its trading partners and allies. These negotiations, these agreements are not going down well with the domestic people. There are enough instances in Canada, in EU, with the French farmers or Indonesian companies who are not very happy about this, right? So even if America starts to produce more locally in long term, the question is, it cannot really sustain on just domestic demand. It has to produce for the world. If the world doesn't want to buy American goods, America can just continue to produce more but not export it out because there's nobody to buy it. That is the bad scenario. And if the bad scenario works out in the long run, then the tariff itself would have failed. But trade would have altered forever because new trade flows would have opened up, and the traditional trade, which was earlier centric to America, might have shifted out to other parts of the world. And that will be a fundamental change in the way global trading happens across the globe. If that happens, it'll be very interesting to watch. And I think my students will multiply by 200% if that happens, because more and more people will ask me lots of questions. I think so.
Indeed, I can see a lot of people asking you a lot of questions if that happens. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Punit, for taking our listeners through this and those three scenarios. And let's see how this plays out. And I'm sure we'll be back to talk about this again.
Just one more point before we end here. Trump, with an executive order, has actually reduced, or rather revoked, this idea of what is called a de minimis rule. The de minimis rule allowed for any parcel or any package under $800 in value to come through to US without paying any tariffs. Come 29th of August, the de minimis rule will be taken away, and the customs will have to check each and every package and make sure that it comes from a country, and then apply the tariffs based on the commodity that's described on the package. So assuming somebody has sent a small aluminum pin costing $5 to somebody in US, they will actually have to put 50% aluminum tariff on that. And then they actually have to charge that to the importer, which can be a retail consumer. And how is that going to happen? I really don't know. The de minimis rule really allowed the customs to have some peace of mind to concentrate on the big shipments. Now, if de minimis rule is taken out, you will actually have a huge issue in terms of overload for customs. So practical implications and operational issues are still not even coming up. And when that happens, this can all go to complete chaos, Marcus, from what I can see.
Now, that's a very good point. Could create a lot of jobs, I guess, for US Customs. But I think on that note, I'm going to leave this here. Thank you so much for your time, Punit, and for taking the time to talk to our listeners today.
Thank you very much. Always lovely talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Seatrade Maritime Podcast, and we look forward to joining you on our next episode.